All right, we're good. So, hello everyone. My name is Ugo Stornaiolo Silva. I am the international correspondent for España Confidencial, and I'm also the host of this podcast, as we may call it, called En Orden, Libertad, uh, Freedom in Order in English. And this is our third episode, and today we have Paul Krause, who is the editor of VoegelinView and who is a graduate of Yale. And we're going to talk about the great books and their significance for civilization. So, welcome, Paul.
It's great to be on your podcast.
Right, my first question in these interviews is usually for our guests to introduce themselves. And I know I've already introduced some of your info, but if you could explain us a little bit more about yourself, that would be great.
Sure. So as you said, and as I think everyone can see from my name ID, I'm Paul Krause. Currently, I'm the editor-in-chief of VoegelinView, which is the online journal of the Eric Voegelin Society. I'm a graduate of Yale Divinity School. I have an MA in Biblical and Religious Studies. I also have an MA in philosophy from the University of Buckingham, where I studied with Sir Roger Scruton right before his death. Despite a background in history, which would be the BA, history, economics, philosophy, religious studies, and philosophy again at graduate school, I have essentially become an arts and literary critic, either by divine providence or happy circumstance. I've always loved literature. And when I started writing as a graduate student at Yale, I was often focusing on bringing out theological, mythological, and philosophical themes in great works of literature, especially the classics, as well as English literature. And that kind of spiraled to where I am now, where I write for multiple publications, as well as doing teaching on great books, literature, the arts, why they matter, and what they portend for the future of human life and civilization.
Well, that was quite an introduction. I knew that you were a student of Roger Scruton. Well, in our channel, we're pretty much very conservative in our political leanings, so that creates a new perspective to explore in this interview with you. So, well, given that most of or the people who are going to hear us maybe or maybe not familiar with the term great books. In Spanish, we call them clásicos, the classical books. How can you describe what a great book is? What do you think are the main elements for a great book to be considered a great book?
Yeah, well, no, this is the perennial question. As you said in Spanish, they go by the name the classics. They go by the name classics too in English, although I suppose great books is a little bit more expansive to where it would include a lot of modern stuff. Classics in America and in Britain would largely be relegated to just the Greek and the Latin texts, and you might include, say, St. Augustine, who sort of straddles the line there, although patristic source material tends to fall outside of the domain of the classics. But there's two ways to understand the great books. One is the sort of normative position. The great books in America and in the broader English world, the great books curriculum started at Columbia University, of all places now, one of the places where they nominally still keep that great book status, but have largely abandoned it. Back in the 1930s, a number of Columbia professors got together in the humanities department and decided for the preservation and the promotion of the Western cultural and civilizational inheritance, they were going to codify together the so-called great books of the Western tradition. They largely focused on classics, English literature. They included some philosophy and religious studies. And so it basically went from Plato and continued on through the English Reformation. So you had inclusions of Shakespeare and Milton. And so in one sense, that's what the great books normatively refers to. It sort of refers to that canon of material that was compiled together in the 1930s. You have another view of the great books and the classics in general, which is a bit more broad and abstract, which would be assessing literature on various merits of the humanities, what it tells us about human life, the human soul, who we are, where we're going. Aristotle is very much foundational for understanding what qualifies a great book as. His great treatise, The Poetics, sort of serves as a foundation for assessing some of that material, as well as other contributions in the humanities. Philosophy and theology often inform how to understand what a great book is. So most people would say, especially now, since great books education is largely the domain of, I would say, various Christian and classical educational schools and models today, assessing a great book would include questions of what does it have to say about love? What does it have to say about the human condition? And what provides the sort of redemption or the original comedic happy ending? Comedy in the classics, of course, meant happiness. You would go through struggle in order to achieve happiness. It wasn't what we generally refer to comedy as today. So great books in the broader sense deal with questions of human life, human existence, the tragedy, the love within the human condition, as well as any potential redemptive aspects of it. And that allows the great books to extend beyond, say, that canonical list that was formulated in the 1930s at the University of Columbia.
Yes, that second definition, which is more broad, it actually allows for books that are not in the Anglo-Saxon tradition to be considered as great books. And this is something for example, in high school and even in college, something that I kind of had this particular confusion. Why do we Hispanics consider some books to be great? Let's say Cervantes or the Spanish authors of the Siglo de Oro, whereas you people in the Anglosphere consider Shakespeare and other English-speaking authors as such. And well, in middle school, I was studying a French school, and we also had this categorization of great books, but from a Francophone's perspective. And so you see there are different traditions about what a great book and what the list of great books are from one country to another, from one society to another, from one civilization to another, even if the West could be composed of various smaller civilizations such as the Anglosphere, the Hispanosphere, and so on and so forth. But the thing is that up until I think the Reformation, we all have like a common root on what the list of great books are. And of course, we have Plato, we have Aristotle, we have some Romans such as Ovid or Cicero, and then we have the medievals, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and pretty much from that common core that is the classics, the ancient classics and the medievals, we have some of the basics of the great books. And my question for you was, what do you think about this particular perspective? Because I know you are also interested in Islamic scholarship and Islamic religious studies. So I think that there might be a difference from what, for example, Muslims could consider a great book.
Yes, well, as you said, there's going to be a cultural and national context to what constitutes great books as well. But I think one of the actual benefits of the English-speaking tradition, the Anglophone tradition of great books, is that it considers itself broad and expansive. So Don Quixote, Cervantes is included in the great books. So are a number of the French authors, including anonymous poems. For instance, you'll have the Song of Roland often included within a great books curriculum. Some of the French philosophers of the modern period get included as well. You'll have Russian authors, Pushkin, Tolstoy, etc., included in. So one of the benefits of the Anglosphere tradition of the great books is its openness to include a lot more than just the English patrimony. But of course, Shakespeare and Milton sort of take pride of place in an English-focused great books curriculum. But I would say if you do focus on what constitutes a great book in all of the different cultural and national traditions, you'll still find a common core, generally dealing with questions of human life, human existence, the problem of love, the struggle for love in human life, and how that struggle of love is manifested in the myriad of different ways that it often emerges in literary contexts. So for instance, you're always going to have a lot of poetry included in any great books tradition, and most of the great poetry that's always included is various forms of love poetry, erotic poetry, sonnets, dealing with something that any reader of, say, the biblical Psalms is going to be familiar with, that deep yearning in the human soul, the human condition, that want for love, that want for justice, retribution. A lot of people might think of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet in dramatic form as a great quintessential drama that captures what a lot of that force of human love and human emotion deals with. But even when you look at the Islamic tradition, so part of my BA in history was actually in Islamic history, Islamic studies. So it's very much part of my own educational and intellectual background. A number of Islamic thinkers I actually think are deeply pertinent and relevant for dealing with questions of modernity, like Ibn Khaldun. But a lot of the great Arabic and Islamic writers were also influenced by writers common to our own intellectual and cultural tradition. They read Plato, they read Aristotle, they read Plotinus, they read a lot of the Greek sources, and in fact, some of the transmission of Greek ideas back into the West came from Islamic scholars during the Crusades. So if there was any silver lining, one can say, about the Crusades, there was an intellectual transfer of ideas between the encounters of West and East. But also Homer is a great poet that is highly prized in the Arab and Islamic tradition. In fact, Homer's Iliad is one of the highest selling books in the Arab language. Essentially, only the Quran sells better than Homer does in the Arabic world. And of course, Homer is the great poet dealing with these fundamental questions of human existence and the human condition: rage, violence, love, peace, redemption. What is a home? Where are we going? Those are all things that Homer dealt with. That's what makes Homer universal. And so that's another aspect that I think the English tradition of the great books has understood, especially in that broader definition that I outlined earlier, is a great book is usually also something that's universal precisely because it's dealing with human nature and the human condition. And this is what makes the great books a very touchy subject for some people, because we live in a world today that wants to get rid of nature. There is no such thing as human nature. There is no such thing as a fixed nature, right? That means you're being an essentialist. Everything is just abstract diversity. Everything is malleable. You can be whatever you want to be. The great books tradition asserts very much the opposite. It doesn't matter what gender you are. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter if you lived 5,000 years ago or if you're living today. There is a certain core of the human condition and of human nature that we all share. And that's what the great books fundamentally deal with. And that's why you have in cultural expressions, obviously, in the mother tongue of a certain culture and a certain civilization and a certain language, those books will always take pride of place because it's much easier to relate to something that you can fundamentally understand and understand in your native language. And there's also, one might say, a little element of pride involved in that too. Obviously, Spaniards are going to want to have a Spanish figure in the top of the great books list, French figures and so on and so forth. But that is something that needs to be understood about what we mean by the great books tradition and why the great books, contrary its critics who say, oh, well, it's very narrow and it's only concerned with these old, dead, white European males. The only people who really say that are people who don't have a lot of intimacy and familiarity with the great books tradition. And especially in American and the English-speaking world, as I've mentioned and have alluded to, there's a lot of new books that keep getting added into that list. You'll find plenty of 20th century material now that would be considered part of a great books curriculum. But what keeps 20th century material in line with Homer, again, is they're fundamentally expressions of that common human nature we're all dealing with. And so when a great books teacher and a great books course designer finds in other cultures books that deal with these concepts, these themes, and these ideas, they actually want to include it because that furthers to show how here's universal human nature. You can go back 2,000 years ago to a culture as seemingly distinct and far away as China or India. You can read their poetry. You can read Homer's poetry side by side, and you realize they're dealing with the same questions. And while, of course, in the Western tradition, Western works will always take up the core and the center and the foundation precisely because we are Westerners, you will often find inclusion of external and diverse source material from China, from India, from the Islamic tradition, precisely because if we're going to assert through the great books that there is a common human condition, a common human soul that we all have, the best way to show that is by the inclusion of additional source material.
And well, considering the addition of source material, there are two particular kind of books that can get or cannot be considered as great books. And those are foundational religious texts, the Bible, the Quran. Maybe in the US and the Western tradition, we could consider some others, the Common Book of Prayer. I could even add for its significance, its historical significance in the US, the Book of Mormon. And on that hand, and on the other, political text, political philosophy. For instance, Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau. And usually, in most of the cases I've read and I've studied about the great books, religious texts are not considered like as part of them, and political texts are considered, but very narrowly. The great books mostly deal with literature. What do you think is happening in there? Because I know that you've covered in your channel and in your essays about political philosophy as well and about religious texts. But people who study and who teach the great books, they tend to sideline a little bit those kinds of books.
Yeah, well, that sort of goes back again to that canonical list of great books from Columbia University, because the men who put that list together were largely in the literature department and the humanities department. Literary texts tended to dominate the core. But it's also important to remember that in the 1920s and the 1930s, when great books curriculum were being designed, it was kind of just assumed that everybody already had religious knowledge and to some extent political knowledge, because in 1930s America, the vast majority of the population was at least culturally Christian, predominantly Protestant, and had, just through their households, through their communities, through their churches, that common knowledge. You mentioned the Book of Common Prayer. Of course, if you go through a lot of great books in the American tradition, you will often find who's the most common type of priestly or pastor character. They generally tend to come from the Anglican or the Episcopal Church or the Congregational Church. A lot of the famous passages that we hear in our film and scattered throughout our literature comes from the Book of Common Prayer, comes from the King James Version of the Bible. So that was sort of just assumed to be part of an already common foundation. What wasn't part of the common foundation was literary texts. Literary texts aren't being read every Sunday, for instance, at church services or in the masses. So there was a push in the creation of the Great Books curriculum to bring that sort of secular common culture that you find in literature. They did include some political source material, so reading a little bit of, say, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, the founding documents of the American Revolution and the Constitution would have been included, but it was simply by the circumstance of who designed the Great Books curriculum in the late 1920s and into the 1930s that literature took the pride of place. Most of the people who were designing the courses were literary professors. But today, especially in the sort of classical education movement in the United States, again, which is a largely promoted now by Reformed Christians, who might better be known as Calvinists colloquially, and Catholics, will often have that broader inclusion. Of course, you're going to be teaching the Bible, you're going to be teaching foundational religious texts and theologians, St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, John Calvin, Martin Luther, and you're going to include the famous political texts. So again, you see today the Great Books revolution in American education actually becoming much more expansive and open than what it was in the past, which I would consider a good thing, especially since my formal educational background is in religious studies and philosophy and political philosophy. And I think having that background and that knowledge is tremendously important, because when you read a lot of the great literary critics, they're often subtly or sometimes very explicitly including religious, theological, and political commentary when they're reading Shakespeare, when they're reading Milton, when you're reading someone like Nathaniel Hawthorne in the American tradition. So if you do not have at least a basic academic foundation and a basic educational foundation in religious studies, theology, and politics, it's going to be really hard to have the full immersion that you can with great books. I was just reading a book that was sent to me by Catholic University of America Press on Shakespeare, and the author was offering a defense of Shakespeare from his postmodern critics, and showing how, there's a lot of theology, religion, and political idealism within Shakespearean drama. And of course, that will often be lost on readers who come to Shakespeare without that background. So there is a strong push in the circles where the great books educational ideal is so foundational now and growing and being promoted, that it's necessary to bring in that inclusion of religious and political texts to supplement a great book's humanities education.
Well, this is part of our current crisis in education in the West. People are just being push toward technical knowledge and towards what makes money in most cases, or simply what serves the current political situation, the current political uh, establishment, and people are not going to try to understand their part of a certain tradition. And I think this is very common not to the United States, but to the rest of the Western world, in which you see people are not into any kind of a general culture. They no longer know about the topics to have a conversation. Uh, for instance, I know that some, maybe the people who actually created the list of great books, they also coined the phrase of the great conversation, just to explain the way all things were related to the other in that list, how an author was building on the ideas of a previous one, and so on and so forth. But nowadays, we're seeing that people are in a very weird sense trying to forget about all of that culture, all of that past knowledge, and how this is affecting the way we behave. I, for instance, come from a country that is forgetting its roots, both local and as part of the Western world. And we're seeing a lot of violence, we're seeing a lot of struggle, a lot of discontent, and maybe that's because we're not being educated in the right way. And in that sense, my question for you was, how do you think the great books can help us to become better citizens, given that this is the great crisis of our age?
Yes, well, it's important that you brought up the issue of technical knowledge, the advancements of science and technology. In fact, that was the concern with the people who designed the great books. Even if you go a little bit earlier with the literary critics known as the new humanists, most famous figure would be Irving Babbitt. That was precisely one of their worries. That we were losing cultural knowledge, especially literary knowledge. We were losing the common foundation of what constituted the culture of any civilization, which is going to be that common root, that common source material that allows us to all have the great conversation together, right? So if you meet somebody who is completely different from you, but has an educational background or a cultural background or a cultural awareness, you can have a conversation with them. But if they lack that, you're going to have no common ground whatsoever to be decent citizens and neighbors with each other. So that was a concern back in the 1920s and the 1930s. That concern really hasn't gone away. If anything, it's only gotten worse since then. But I will want to preface here, though, to say that some of my essays dealing with the humanities and literary criticism might make some cheap shots on STEM, but I actually think STEM is in fact very important. Perhaps that's counterintuitive as somebody who writes on humanities, great books, and who promotes it to students. At the same time, I tell students, you really need to learn coding. At the bare minimum, you should learn coding. You should know how to design your own website. You need to be in touch with the digital age because you will find potentially, as we're finding today in certain circles, that technology, our digital age, is actually a great medium to reach new people, to reach people on different continents about the great books tradition and how, it's kind of paradoxical. How do you stay human in an age of technology when you're using technology? We're using technology right now in our conversation. 100 years ago, this conversation would not be happening. We would all have to be crammed into a library auditorium or a classroom. So you actually had to physically be at the place where a lecture was taking place. Whereas today, while that still happens, of course, you can live stream it, or you could do a recording and then upload it to YouTube or Twitch or any of the various other streaming services. So I do think there is also a great benefit and positive that technology brings assuming that we use technology in a responsible way. And that's one of the great questions that a great books education deals with, because you're exactly right. One of the core educational philosophies within a humanistic education is how to be a good human being and how to be a good citizen, how to be a good neighbor. These were the central questions that preoccupied philosophers like Aristotle and Cicero. It influenced St. Augustine, and it influences us today. And I've often argued in a lot of my essays and articles that, one of the reasons why you should read the great books isn't just because it's going to awaken that common human foundation and that common human soul that we have, but it really allows us to understand what it really means to be human. I'm going to give an example of this. I think St. Augustine gave the best understanding of what it means to be human. Of course, he was influenced by his reading of Genesis. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? So it doesn't really matter whether or not Augustine was right in the sense of, well, did he interpret the author of Genesis 1 correctly? That's beside the point, because that's not what influenced this cultural understanding of what it means to be made in the image of God. Augustine said to be made in the imago Dei was to be made in wisdom, for wisdom, and in love, for love. And of course, love requires more than the self. This is actually one of his arguments, philosophical arguments, for why the Trinity is real. Because if you just have a unitary God who loves himself, he has no reason to share that love with others, because there is nobody else to share that love with. So Augustine's argument for the Trinity philosophically was precisely because there are three persons who love each other and share that love with one another, they then extend that love out to the creation of the angels and then to the creation of the earth. And that really informed much of the Western anthropological tradition. I think he's fundamentally right, because I think anybody who has a modicum of experience in living life in the world wants precisely that. We want to be loved. We want to be loved by others. And I think one of the dangerous temptations of our technological age is people who haven't received that love trying to now receive it through digital avatars and digital mediums. But that fundamentally denies the reality of what philosophers and theologians would call the incarnate life. We are incarnate creatures. Our souls are embodied in these bodies. These bodies aren't bad. Therefore, actual love entails an intimacy with other people. And Augustine says, well, that's also because the Trinity is an intimate relation of love between three persons. And I think if you do look at the great books tradition, wherever they're found, whatever culture, whatever nationality, that's precisely what you start to find in all the poetry and all the great stories and all the great works of literature. You have a often diverse and disparate set of people coming together, struggling for love, wanting to have their love recognized by another person. If you take the darker road, you can obviously say, well, there are elements of lust involved in this as well, which is why you should read other great books of literature and other great works, because some of them show that line. It's not just all sunshine and rainbows, but there's a lot of struggle, distress, and malevolence that is also involved in that desire to love and to be loved. But I would say in our world today, which is increasingly atomized, so atomistic individualism in philosophy is this idea that we're all just atoms and we're all essentially separated from one another, that we're not really social creatures. There's a certain misanthropic notion to this. In fact, I would argue that this is actually found in a lot of the Enlightenment philosophers. People like Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, they hated other people. So did Spinoza, by the way. And it's also not a coincidence, with the exception of Rousseau, who fathered children out of wedlock, but never did anything with them. Most of the great so-called liberal philosophers who promote this idea of individualism, they were never married. They never had a family. And if you're like Spinoza, you had one moment of love, you got spurned, and then you just trashed love for the rest of your life. And you spoke about this exalted view of reason. Reason alone will save us. And that pushes us towards this technological tyranny. Whereas human love in its incarnate form is actually redemptive. And for me, as somebody who's also a film critic, this is why I love film so much, and even pop film, Hollywood blockbusters, because as we live in the age of film and technology, they too are engaged in the great conversation in the ways that technology demands. And if you look at a lot of films, especially starting with Star Wars, up through today, I think Avatar and Interstellar are great, fairly recent representatives of this tradition too. If you actually take this great book's curricula and the spirit of it and apply it to films, that's exactly what all these films are talking about. When you consider Star Wars, look at, well, what does the Empire really represent? It's technological tyranny, it's scientific tyranny. The Death Star is a technological monstrosity. Darth Vader himself is something of a technological monstrosity. Who are all the heroes in Star Wars? They're actual organic life forms. And how does this evil empire, the dark side of the Force, which I would interpret as technological tyranny, how is that actually defeated in the original Star Wars trilogy? It's through an act of love of a father for his son to overthrow that technological tyranny. And how does the ending of Return of the Jedi conclude? The one ending for Darth Vader is we finally get to see him and his human face, right? It's a return of the human face. It's a return of the human heart. And then, of course, you have the great party celebration on the moon, where all the various forms of life are celebrating together in a dance, right? So it has a very humanistic ending. That's the same story being told in James Cameron Avatar. I actually think that's pretty much true of all of James Cameron's films, including Terminator. If you look at Terminator, it's that same story, right? And there's an implicit theology in that too. If you look at Terminator, right? What brings Reese back in time, so to speak? It's actually love. Love is the transcendent force. Love is what unites. And love brings about an incarnation. You get the birth of a heroic son who's going to overthrow technological tyranny. Sarah Connor is this fertile young woman. There's a humanistic face to it. It's the same story in Avatar, even though we see the Na'vi and so-called aliens. Well, what are the Na'vi if you really think about it from a deep perspective? Well, they are what humans used to be before the advent of industry and technology. It takes a very romantic view of life. Same thing in Interstellar. How does Joseph Cooper's character achieve the so-called salvation, the movement on an arc from one world to the next to preserve human life? It's retelling of the Noah's Ark story, right? It's the love that he has for his daughter. And science, actually, in all of these films, even though they're considered science fiction, fantasy, science, technology, and mathematics is always on the wrong side, the dark side. They're the ones bringing death and destruction. And when you read great books, the great books are all telling us essentially the same thing. And that's why I think it's important to read the great books and great poetry in our technological age. Even though we all might benefit from technology, I know I certainly do, and I make use of technology, their explanations and their stories that love is really between human beings and incarnate bodies is what needs to be, I think, reclaimed and recaptured in our technological and digital age, because we usually have a temptation with technology to fly into it, sort of a Gnostic escape into these digital avatars, which, in my humble opinion, is never going to actually satisfy the yearnings of the human heart. And there's another danger in that too, and we see this all the time from social media influencers who, after years of being burdened by everything that goes on, they come out and say, yeah, I went down this deep, dark rabbit hole and it was all fake. All these pictures, all it is lighting, angles, touch-ups. It's not real. Well, if the real meaning of human life is love and wisdom, where are you going to find love and wisdom? You're going to find it in books. You're going to find it in the depository of the human heart and the human imagination, which is writing, whether it's theological, political, literary. Where are you not going to find it? You're not going to find it in mediums that don't actually have anything to say about it. Technology is, you either can take the position that technology is neutral on this question, or technology leads us down the dangerous path of annihilation. I think a lot of our artists have taken that route, but I think some of them also leave a certain openness to a neutrality. If you're strong enough, say spiritually or metaphysically, you can overcome the dangers of technology. That is actually one of the reasons why I think Star Wars was such a successful franchise, especially the original trilogy and even the prequel trilogy. We won't talk about what Disney did, but that's a fundamental message that is implicit in Star Wars, right? If you come to embrace the Force, which is George Lucas's fantasy world for essential sort of spirituality, you'll be able to overcome the dangers of technology. But it's important to remember that as Star Wars ended, it doesn't mean we're going to be primitives again. It's just we now have the strength and the fortitude and the courage to persevere in this technological age. And I think that is something that Great Books Education helps to tell us and helps to teach us, that through a good understanding of the communication of great books and the spirit of love that they're trying to teach us, we can also have the strength, the fortitude, and the perseverance to actually live lives in the world we inhabit.
Yeah, well, in this mini lecture, I was thinking to myself about that piece I wrote a while ago about conservatism and love, and I tried to use the argument from Abraham Maslow's pyramid of needs. For me, my perception of love as the foundational value of conservatism is that it not only allows for self-fulfillment, but also for the creation of communities of
That's right.
intermediate bodies. And well, this is a lot of what most modern and classical conservatives have tried to promote, how to solve the problem of community, how to create stronger communities, how to not lose communities to atomization and to the totalitarianism of technology. In a sense, technology should be a way for humans to have dominion over nature and to make our lives better, not to be dominated by them. And this is something that, at least in our current age, is very difficult to distinguish. How are you making use of technology and how technology is not making use of you? Because there's a sense in which you have some kind of community around you. You have friends, you have your family, you have your fellow faculty, you have a professional association, you have some kind of guild, you have a neighborhood, and you relate to people around you. And in that sense, you create relations of love, friendship, intimacy, conversation. But with technology, we're losing a lot of that connection we have with our fellow human beings. And well, some of the books I've read, I don't think they're great books yet, but some of the books I read about the problem of community, and one of the main struggles of conservatism in our current days is how to promote community, how to build community. And of course, we can have that problem with thinking that technology is by itself bad. technology is something that needs to be overcome, but that can also lead to a certain primitivism that is not good for nature as well. We humans have to be able to live better lives than our past primitive ancestors. We need to be able to have dominion over nature, so nature doesn't dominate us, and we have to make nature to be useful to us. We have to eat. We have to have the materials to write and to promote or expressions of the soul.
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought up the issue of love and conservatism, because obviously, as a student of Roger Scruton's, that was one of his core foundations too. You also find that in Michael Oakeshott. You find that in Edmund Burke. So anybody who tells you that conservatism is about hatred doesn't know what they're talking about. They're uneducated fools and ignoramuses who have never had any experience reading what is the canonical sort of great books within the conservative tradition. This goes back to Aristotle and Cicero even. Cicero, if you want to say, Cicero was one of the founding fathers of classical conservatism within the Roman tradition, his opposition to the tyranny of Julius Caesar, as well as his opposition to populist demagoguery during his time in the Senate. If you read the Republic, if you read Cicero's letters, he's talking about the same thing, that what moves him, what moves his heart, what moves the optimates, the best men in the Roman Senate, right? It's this love for the Republican values and virtues and homeland of Rome. And this, I think, is one of the implicit elements of why great books education is so important, and why it's actually achieving such a under the radar, but if you know where to look, you'll spot it, this great renewal and revival in the United States, is because that question of community. Well, how do you form a community? Well, community can only form because of love. A common heart, a common love, as St. Augustine says, brings people together in a community in a peaceable, civil, and conversational way. And this is why you will often find communities forming over common loves, right? So if you have a bunch of people who love to read books, what do? They form a book club. You have a lot of people who love to play a certain sport, baseball, football, soccer. I'm American, so we call it soccer. I know everybody else in the world calls it football. They come together and they start a little intramural league. And I think you're right that the great problem that so many of us are dealing with today is how exactly do we form communities in a world and in a society in which it's so much easier to just stay at home, stay in your basement, log on to a computer, play video games. But here I would say, again, here's the neutrality of technology, or at least the potential benefit of technology. If technology, and this is a fine line too, depending on, well, how can you really qualify and quantify whether or not we're using technology to reach other people, or whether we're just using technology for our own self-desires. Again, this is why reading St. Augustine is so important, because he has a lot to say about understanding the difference between love and lust. Love, of course, is always directed to others. It's selfless. It's self-giving. Lust is always directed to oneself. Augustine calls that the incurvatus in se, the inward curve to the self. But if technology is being used to reach other people and to form communities, and then you eventually take the next step and you meet in person, I would say that's one of the benefits of technology. And in fact, I know that's true in my life. As a millennial, grow up with technology, so I'm part of the technological age. I still have active accounts on various online forums, and periodically I have met people who I've known for 5 to 10 years on these forums, and then it's like, oh, you know what? You only live 2 hours away from me. Why don't we meet, have dinner together or something? Let's spend a day together. That happened too when I was over in England studying on one forum. He turns out to be a very good friend of mine now, as I keep a correspondence with him, and we often chat on Discord from time to time. We met in London, and we had a wonderful day of pub crawling and restaurant adventures and adventures in the art gallery, the National Art Gallery in London. But that is the great problem that we're dealing with, is, how do we form communities? Is there something more to community than just love? That's a question that I think everybody will ultimately wrestle with. But I would add, have an addendum to that by saying, we can't be afraid to actually live our lives. I think that's what a lot of people are suffering from. I think a lot of people have a fear of life for a whole number of reasons, not the least, of course, because we've been suffering from a global pandemic for 2 years, and the media and science and medicine have been telling people, if you're going to catch the coronavirus, you're going to drop dead. We had all these absurd projections too, by the way, tens of millions and hundreds of millions of people are going to die. I don't want to sound crude on the issue, because we all know people have died, and we all know people who have had COVID. I mean, I had COVID about 8 months ago, but I got over it fairly quickly. And this is where I think reading a lot of the political texts are equally instructive in a great book's education, because when you read, for instance, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, Rousseau, Spinoza, and so many of the other so-called liberals, what actually moves human beings into society for them? It's fear. It's fear of death. It's fear of being plundered. It's fear of your neighbor. That's really no way to actually want to live a life or have a society constructed. So you have, for instance, Hobbes says that, what is the social compact trying to guard us from? We no longer have the greatest good to strive for. We have the greatest evil to try to prevent. Well, this becomes a problem if we're creatures of love, because as we all know, love hurts. Love can break a lot of people's hearts. And if you want to live a life of perpetual comfort and security, what is one thing you're not going to do? You're probably not going to try to love anything, because love is intensely particular. Love is something that, to use a term that is often applied negatively, but I would apply it here positively. Love is something that is jealous. Love causes you to want to defend and to cherish something deeply particular. It's very easy to love in the abstract sense. It's very difficult to love in the concrete sense. I like to make the joke that this is the wisdom of Jesus of Nazareth. He didn't tell people to love humanity. He told you to love your neighbor, because it's sometimes very difficult to love your neighbor. It's really easy to say that I love humanity, I love mankind. Some of the worst murderers in political history have been people who said, I love mankind. Robespierre is the perfect example of that. It's really easy to claim that you love in the abstract sense, because loving in the abstract sense doesn't get your hands dirty. It doesn't get your soul dirty. It doesn't get your heart dirty. Loving in the concrete sense is very difficult. You can have a great relationship with your neighbor or your friend, but if you get into a little spat, tempers go flaring, and you're suffering from the pains and the miseries of whatever transpired in that. And hopefully, you make up and you forgive. And that's another one of the great tropes of literature. I mean, this is all over Shakespeare. How do so many of the characters in his comedies end up having the happy life at the end of the plays? Forgiveness through love brings marriage and happiness. And so again, the great books tradition seems to inform us about the realities of the human heart, the human soul, and the human condition. And it's important to highlight that too, because, well, how do these little communities, how do these little banquets, and how do these little parties, and how do these families form in all of these great books going back 2,500 years to today? It's never formed through anything other than love.
Just by hearing you, I had like two ideas. The first one is of Burke's Little Platoons. They're based pretty much on love, the love for your family, the love for a particular sport, the love for a particular trade, and then also the main topic of certain classical books, the Odyssey, for instance, just a quest for Ulysses, for Odysseus, to come back to his homeland, to come back to his wife, or some of the texts in medieval literature. Some of the texts in modern literature about the same topics. I was thinking particularly of The Great Gatsby, which is somewhat of an obsessive love of Gatsby for.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. And this is the unique thing too about the literary tradition, that those informed by theological dimension can become attuned to in assessing the merits and the demerits of a book. Fitzgerald, in my opinion, is Fitzgerald is one of my favorite authors, American authors. Fitzgerald is part of this great American tradition in literature. It goes back to the 19th century with figures like Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, right? That they have inherited, Fitzgerald inherits this idea of what a great English literary scholar from the 20th century, R.W.B. Lewis, he used to teach at my alma mater, Yale. He has this book called The American Atom, where he assesses so-called heroic figures in the American literary tradition as an archetype of what he calls the American atom, this individual who begins a story with boundless opportunity, this great desire for love, but then gets beaten down, bashed, and ultimately succumbs to death and destruction in the pursuit of this individual ambition. This, what Augustine would say, was ultimately a pursuit of lust rather than love. That is something that you see in The Great Gatsby. And that is something you see in all of Fitzgerald's great works. You have these figures so enthusiastic about life and the future of opportunities for themselves, and they're seeking love, and it ultimately doesn't work out for them. And I would say that is the quintessential element, of course, of tragedy, as opposed to comedy. Tragedy and comedy are both included in the great books because, one might say, we'll let the reader to determine for themselves whether or not they want to adopt the tragic outlook or the comedic outlook. But one of the things I like about that, when you're reading tragic books included in a great book's curriculum and comedic works in a great book's curriculum, you'll learn a lot about yourself based on which books you prefer and whether or not you think there's any potential redemptive aspect to love, or whether or not we're just all ultimately doomed to that sort of nihilistic tragedy of, well, where did it get Gatsby? Got him dead. Where did it get Dick Diver? Where did it get Amory Blaine? Didn't exactly get them where they wanted to be. But again, that's one of the great things about an encounter with the great books. Whether it's in the Odyssey, where we see the happy homecoming, or you read Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, which ends in tragedy, both books are fundamentally dealing with the human heart in the human soul, that quest, that desire, that adventure for love. And even though they end on different in different places, the adventure was the same, and that's the adventure of human life. And so the great books also, I think, calls us to that adventure. It calls us to get out of our comfort, to get out of our homes, and to embrace the world. And that is something that actually moves J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Who are the hobbits? The hobbits are, these little Englander types, these humans who are just walled up in their homes. They don't like to go out. They don't have an adventure. But who are the principal characters that actually impact the world of Middle-earth in Tolkien's stories? It's precisely those unseen heroes who come out of their homes, come out of their comfort, Bilbo Baggins, Frodo Baggins, Samwise Gamgee, and they go out on this great adventure and this great quest that is life. And if there's a lot of risk involved in that, there's a lot of struggle involved in that, but there's a reason why we remember everybody who's engaged in that kind of life. People don't remember the person who never left the comfort of their house, and that is something deeply instructive within the great books tradition. We love to read stories of heroes, stories of adventure, stories of love. Nobody wants to read a story of somebody who's just cooking, cleaning, reading the newspaper, and griping about politics.
Yeah, well, in that sense, I think that conservatives and in the conservative tradition, you'll find two sides of that philosophy
Yeah,
of love
the need for a home, which
and the need
calls you,
for adventure.
but then, yeah, exactly. And that's why Aristotle is so important in the great books tradition too, because who's the great character or the great philosopher who teaches us about the golden mean, right? You have to find that balance. And I've talked about this on other podcasts and interviews too. I mean, I even mentioned to you why we're having this conversation today instead of say Wednesday, is because I'm going out hiking on Wednesday. I live here in the Appalachians, right on the border of West Virginia and Virginia. And it's such a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place. And it's so great to just be able to wake up in the morning and to be like, I'm going to stuff my backpack with water, beef jerky, and some bread and protein bars. And I'm just going to spend a whole day hiking because you never know who you're going to encounter on the hiking trail. And if you're like me, you like to go to breweries and restaurants to fill up on liquid carbs and pizza or burger after walking 10 or 15 miles in the day. You never know who you're going to meet there. So, I mean, I've had so many wonderful hiking experiences, going up to the tops of mountains, visiting waterfalls. But then there's the other side to hiking. It's the people whom you meet. People that I'll probably never see ever again in my life, but for 15 minutes, for 30 minutes, for an hour to maybe 2 hours, if you're just all of a sudden having dinner together with them, that just makes the day so much more special. I mean, I'll share a story. Last autumn, I was down in North Carolina hiking, and I came back after a day of hiking a mountain trail, and I ended up meeting another gentleman who was much older than me. But so I'm a native of Ohio. I grew up in Ohio. He was also from Ohio. He was a retired doctor. So we were both Ohioans. We both learned that we loved hiking. We both learned that we often hike for spiritual nourishment. I also learned that he has an oceanside home in Colombia. And so for 2 hours, from about 5 o'clock to 7, as the sun was setting on this beautiful autumn day in this sleepy little town in North Carolina, called Sparta. So I guess there's some relevance to a great books conversation, a town named Sparta. And you know, it was a wonderful evening. So I had a great morning driving to the destination, getting breakfast, and then spending 6 hours out hiking the trail, and then going to this place that I saw on my phone saying this is the brewery, this is the place to be. And you go there, and I met another Ohioan, and we had impromptu dinner together for 2 hours. And again, that's the aspect of adventure. But then you also have, well, where am I going at the end of all this? It doesn't matter if I'm spending a day out in the trail or multiple days out on the trail. Eventually, I'm coming back to my home, or at least where I live. And Roger Scruton said that is what makes the adventure worthwhile, is you have to have a destination in mind. You have to have a home in mind, right? Because that's not only the adventure of Odysseus or Ulysses, that's also the adventure of Aeneas. Now, Aeneas' circumstances are slightly different. He's going to build a home where he's going, but there needs to be that final destination, that home within the adventurous life. I'm a little bit more partial to the adventure side, especially as somebody who's lived on multiple continents and multiple states in the last 9 years. So as a barista here in the town that I live called me, she said that I'm pretty much a nomad. That's pretty much accurate. That's how the last 9 years of my life have been. But at the same time, whether it's been in China, Israel, England, Connecticut, where I live now, or back in Ohio, even if I was only residing in a place for a short period of time, I always did have a home to go to. And, you know, speaking of sort of homestead and familiarity, that's another way to have community form. So where I live now, most Saturdays, if I'm in town, I have lunch at the microbrewery across the street from me. And having gone so frequently, I now have a great relationship with the co-owners, and I have a relationship with some of the regulars that come in around the same time, right? And so that's one of the core elements of why it is important to have a place that you can call a home, or at least have a place that you frequent regularly, that you have some sort of relationship with. And there again is that important word of a relationship. If you can't really love if you don't have a relationship. You need to have a relationship with something or someone in order to love. And from that relationship, a community can begin to form.
Yeah. Well, from these, there are two topics that maybe more abstract but can describe very well the situation. First, you have the hero's journey, by which you have to complete some steps before you return home, but you have changed.
Yeah, or you discover a home through the hero's journey. I mean, because that's to go back to Star Wars, one of my favorite films, of course. That's Luke's story, right? I mean, granted, his home sort of gets destroyed at the beginning of A New Hope, but through his going through the heroic adventure and the heroic quest, he also finds a community at the end of it, with Leia and Han Solo and C-3PO and the Ewoks and everything like that. So, you know, that's another thing that sometimes, and I'm so glad you brought it up here, sometimes gets missed in the notion of the heroic journey or the heroic adventure, is even if you start it without a home and without a community, you will almost universally find in all of these great works of literature dealing with that. The ending is you discover a new home, you discover a new family. And knowing a little bit about your background, that might be illustrative of your life, right? Because of the loves that you have, the intellectual loves that you have, you ended up in a new community that you can say is now sort of your adopted family.
Yeah, right now, pretty much that's it. I mean, it's part of the journey. I come from a country in Latin America, from Ecuador, but through my intellectual appetite. I found people with similar interest in other continents. Right now, I'm hosting this podcast for a Spanish newspaper. Uh, I'm currently in Alabama at the Mises Institute with fellow right-wing libertarians talking about freedom, about how to build communities that would be outside of the sphere of the state. Uh, I had to flew from my home in Ecuador to Alabama. I've been staying for a month and a half in here. So yeah, there's a pretty much there's a sense on why I came here. There's a sense on why I am relating to these people, why I'm doing what I'm doing, and you find that there's a community building, but there's also a community that has been previously built, a community to which you can return. There's a relationship and something that attaches you from both communities, from the one you are currently at and from the one you come. And in our current times, and this is also something I wanted to talk, is that by destroying tradition, by forgetting tradition, we are trying to cut those attachments, those
That's right.
links that we had from our past, from our ancestors, and for our future. I mean, if you don't know where you're coming from, how can you know where you're going? What's your
Yes.
journey?
Yes, that's. I think you assess the problem very accurately, because we live in an age of deracination, uh, dislocation. Uh, so, I mean, again, these are the problems, because, I mean, in many ways, I've kind of lived that life, even though I would also identify it as somebody who's quote unquote conservative. But kind of like you, I mean, I would say my politics lean more libertarian. Uh, a number of my good friends are also have ties to the Mises Institute. And I think it's one of the misnomers that people say, well, libertarians just want to be left alone. Well, that's not true at all. A lot of libertarians want an actual community. They want a community because they understand the state destroys communities. This is the whole reason why you want to have a community outside the purview of the state. Now, yes, there may be some very crude libertarians, just like how there are crude conservatives and crude liberals, crude leftists. You find crude people all over the place who, of course, tend to be the most popular people on social media, because human nature tends to devolve to the lowest appetites. But that problem of, people losing bonds, losing their homes, losing their tradition, causes a lot of angst and anxiety, and that is, in I would say, in my humble opinion, I think this is one of the other reasons why we're seeing a sort of dysphoria and dissonance over identity right now. People don't know who they are anymore, and when you don't know who you are, you're always seeking some form of identity. So I'll just say I find it very shallow, these right-wing critics of quote-unquote identity, as if they don't have an identity. Everybody lives by identity. There's not a single person who doesn't live by an identity of some sort. I think the real reason why you see this identity crisis is because of what you said. We don't know who we are anymore. We've lost our attachments to our home. We've lost attachment to tradition and history and heritage and culture. And again, that was one of the things that the great books tradition was trying to counteract. Because even if you come from a broad great books tradition, tradition that I sort of support, one that would be inclusive of a lot of material outside of just the English-speaking tradition, nevertheless, what is that foundational pillar and cornerstone of what a great books education is trying to provide? It's trying to provide that common cultural identity that can bring people together. And it can bring people together again through that common love. I mean, this is one of the great things about a great book. You can find someone from China, you can find someone from Saudi Arabia, you can find someone from Sweden, you can find someone from Latin America, you can find someone from America. If they all love Shakespeare, you're going to have a community and you're going to have an identity emerge from that. But that springs from that common love. And that community can only form from that common love because there is that common understanding, that common identity and common culture that links everybody together. And to go back to one of your questions earlier, I think that is one of the problems that we're suffering from today is as we've lost our attachments to so many things, nothing has really come in to replace it except for what? The state. And when the state replaces everything, it becomes bloated, it becomes big, it becomes bureaucratic, and ultimately we all become somewhat servile and dependent upon it. And I would say, as somebody who also likes a lot of adventure and freedom, that's not a particularly conducive way to live your life. And so one of the aspirations and one of the hopes of the educational philosophy within humanism and the great books is it can provide either sustenance to an already cultivated and formed identity and make it richer, or it can provide you a enriching identity that you're actually seeking. I think I'm a great example of that because, I don't have a BA in English. I don't have an MA in English. I don't have a PhD in English. I outside of honors and AP English in my primary education in high school, I haven't moved in formal English studies. But what is 70% of my writing now? It's on literature. It's through the discovery of the great books. I like to also say that I'm an accidental classicist. You study patristics in theology, you study classical philosophy, and you start moonlighting as a literary critic, and you're focusing on Homer and the Greek tragedians and the Roman poets. You kind of just accidentally turn out to be a classicist that way, and a wonderful relationship forms as a result of that. And that relationship of love is so essential to the understanding of what the great books is trying to achieve. And this too goes back to a little bit of what Edmund Burke says is, what makes our society, English society, so pleasant and beautiful, he says, is because it's a relationship between the dead, the living, and the to be born. Well, who do you end up having relationships with in the great books, right? People who are dead. But in some sense, right, they're still alive because you're engaging with them now. You have that relationship of love and dialogue with them. And if you play your cards right, maybe 200 years down the road, somebody's going to have that dialogue with you. And so you end up coming in line with Plato and Aristotle and Edmund Burke. And, I'll admit a little bit of my vanity. I hope that's true for me one day. 200 years from now, I hope people will be able to read my book. So my book is a published collection of essays, literary essays, that have been published over the past few years at the various places I write. I continue to do that, and hopefully, if somebody comes to love Plato or Homer or Aeschylus through me, I'll be credited somewhere with that.
But let's talk of someone who just died very recently and who has been very influential. I didn't met him, you certainly did. That was Roger Scruton. And a lot of people were influenced to love and to learn about the ideas of community, of the classics, of a certain prudence in politics and in culture. And that was through his work. I mean, some people had the chance, like you, to meet him, but some others, like me, we only learned from him and about him by books, by articles, by essays, by videos as well.
Yes. And that's the great thing about the life of the intellect and the life of the heart when it's connected together, because a lot of times we see the two as separated, because we live in that sort of post-Cartesian mentality. Everybody who has ever studied with Roger and everybody who was ever a friend of Roger would say what was great about him was how the heart and the mind were interlinked, and how that is what really drew everybody to him. And that is so important for your listeners and for people to understand is, and again, that's why I prefaced a while back that I thought Augustine had the best understanding of human nature, because what is implied by saying you're made in wisdom for wisdom, life of the mind, in love for love, life of the heart. So the two are intimately interlinked. That is what drew me to Roger. That's what drew all of us to Roger. And, you know, Roger is an interesting figure because a lot of people might remember him for philosophy or for politics, but many of us who came to him loved him for the arts, for literature, for drama, for music. He was a great scholar of Richard Wagner. He wrote his own operatic pieces of music. He also wrote novels. He was a man who was fluent not only in religion, philosophy, and politics, but he was fluent in the arts, in literature, in poetry, in drama, and music. And that is something that the sort of new great books educational philosophy is hoping to achieve, as I mentioned, by bringing in more politics, literature, theology, art, music, to have as enriched an experience as possible. Because this is also something that is implicitly influenced by Augustine. Augustine thought that the enriched life, the life of the total human, totus homo, was somebody who loved as much of everything as possible. Now we might say, you know, that's not ideal. Most people are only ever going to love a couple of things. That's true. But there are going to be people who can, through love, through will, end up loving many, many things. And that does make your life richer and fuller than if you just love one or two things. Not that loving one or two things is necessarily bad. A lot of people find great enrichment and great fulfillment in that. But for those who have a little bit more of an adventurous side, it's not a surprise that so many of us ended up finding Roger, because he lived a life that was exactly like that. And he's the great example now of, here's another name who has entered the list of the great thinkers who, now that even though he's dead, people are still talking about him, and we'll talk about him for 100 years from now.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Well, since you mentioned the thing about intellect and spirit and soul, when I was younger, I had this problem understanding the elements of humanity of the human being from a Catholic perspective. I'm Catholic, and I had this friend who's a priest who actually explained to me that our conception should be one of we have a body, we have a soul, and we have a spirit. And I didn't understand what was the spirit, because soul and spirit, they must be very similar. They must be the same thing. And then I realized the spirit is intellect, is our intellective capacity. And that's when it struck to me. You have the triune nature of God, which is actually analogous to the triune nature of human nature. You have a body that would be Christ in the Christian conception. You have a soul that would be God the Father, and you have an intellect that would be the Holy Spirit. In that sense, there's also an argument for man being made in God's image.
Yeah. And you may not know this. I wrote my thesis on Augustine at Yale. That's actually strongly influenced by Augustine's work, De Trinitate. And it's no surprise if you actually look into the history of the great books and the humanistic tradition in education, that contrary stereotypes, it's actually been religious individuals who have pushed these great educational movements and these reforms in education. I mean, it's easy to poke fun at various charismatic types who you see on the news or in popular media or shows, but that's not actually representative of the broader intellectual and cultural inheritance and spirit of Christianity and of the Catholic tradition in particular, which has a very rich intellectual pedigree behind it. But no, what you highlighted again gets back to why this understanding of the great books is actually so appealing to so many people, because the core of that great books notion is, you know, we're dealing with human nature, we're dealing with the human condition, we're dealing with the heart and the mind, we're dealing with the body and the soul, and we're trying to offer a way and a pathway for people to live as a result of that. And in the world we inhabit today, I think that's why it's so essential and so important for us to rediscover the beauty and the love of the great books, because we live often very transient lives. We live lives that are often very shallow and hollow, but yet we are always seeking something deeper, something richer, something more meaningful. And this is where the questions of theology and God are rather important in the great books philosophy, because one of the underlying and side elements to the great books idea was we're entering an age of metaphysical and ontological impoverishment because of just this practical, pragmatic, utilitarian mindset and way of living, that we need to capture who we actually are. And that is what spurred the formation of the new humanists, Irving Babbitt, Paul Elmer Moore, both of whom were Christians. Also, Russell Kirk, another great conservative figure, T.S. Eliot, another as well, also an Anglican, C.S. Lewis. So what you find in a lot of the progenitors of the great books, philosophy and ideal, and the men and the women who created the great books ideal and the canon, was actually an explicit, if not implicit, cornerstone for what they were trying to achieve. This rediscovery of a metaphysical and an ontological richness and way of life. And for those who are religious, that ultimately means you're probably going to end up back on the road to God, who is the source of metaphysics and ontology.
Yes, absolutely. And well, we're living very lonely lives compared to the lives of our ancestors. This is maybe one of the reasons that intellectually inclined people are trying to look again into the great books. They are trying to get answers for some of their questions about God, about the universe, about the meaning of life. And at least through the great books, we're finding communities, we're finding each other, we're finding like-minded people. If you're passionate about something or you have something you believe in, for instance, right now at the Mises Institute, I applied more as a conservative than a libertarian, but they accepted me. They told me, yeah, you can come here to do research. And I found people who are very similar to me. My interests still are different. So we are creating a community. We're relating to each other. We're exchanging with each other. This is part of what we actually need in our current times. If people are still going to be isolated in their homes and in their minds and in their souls, there's nothing that good that can come out of it. And I know this is a meme, and a lot of people are repeating it. This is more of a out of a joke that live in the pod eat the bugs. But if we're doing nothing to cultivate our minds, to cultivate our souls, this is going to be in a very near future.
Yeah, and it's going to be a problem that just gets exacerbated. And I think that's one of the reasons why in the United States in particular, great books education is experiencing a revival in Christianity. But interestingly enough, it's also experiencing a revival in various Islamic circles too. You may not be familiar with it, but I am. I'm actually a great admirer of many of his lectures, his talks, and his papers. There's a place out in Berkeley called Zaytuna College, and it's an Islamic liberal arts college that's trying to do the same thing within the Islamic tradition, restore a sense of wholesomeness within an Islamic way of life that brings it back in dialogue with the great books that actually deeply informed a lot of Islamic philosophy, theology, and literature. And I think what they're doing there is a great, wonderful thing. And it's, again, just another example of how that desire for metaphysical enrichment and a metaphysical life, it finds a home predominantly among the religious, be they Muslim like Hamza Youssef, who's the president of Zaytuna College, among Protestants, among Catholics, and even among, say, Eastern Orthodox, as well as Jews. This great flourishing, this great revival of the liberal arts, of the humanities, and of the great books is occurring in these circles precisely because the questions of the great books ultimately deal with questions of the soul. And if you're dealing with questions of the soul, you're necessarily dealing with questions of God.
Yes, absolutely. I do know of Zaytuna College.
Oh, that's great that you do then.
I have a friend that she writes for their journal. She's I think she's a convert, an English convert to Islam, and she writes about a lot of the problems of postmodernity, but from an Islamic perspective. She has written about how to perceive things like TikTok and that from Islamic perspective.
See, there's a perfect example of the love of great books, and the humanistic spirit brings you into dialogue with people that, if you just listen to Bill Maher or crude people in the media, well, they have nothing in common with us, and that's actually the opposite, because when lives of the heart and the mind are interlinked, you will always find people who have the same loves as you do. And you can often find yourself enriched by what they have to say.
Yeah, and this is something that's also very important, because in the outside society, in mainstream media, in what normal people, common people do, you see there's a lot of polarization. But in intellectual circles, you're seeing that there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of understanding, even if there are very opposite perspectives on a certain topic. I found myself to be more welcomed by people in the libertarian right, by people in the Christian left, than with some of my fellow nominally conservatives in Latin America, because these people, they are not trying to engage in the great conversation. They are not learning.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue that we all end up dealing with. I opine about this sometimes to some of my friends on other podcasts and on cell phone calls with people who know me. It's like, yeah, I can't, I won't name names, but it's like, yeah, I've been rejected time and time and time and time and time and time again at this place, and yet I give that same submission over to somebody else without a change, and they accept it. There's a reason why the left dominates our cultural institutions, and that's because a certain form of very crude conservatism has just abandoned cultural conversation. And what amounts to culture for so many of these folks on the right is being a jerk to 20-year-olds on a college campus. That's not going to convert anybody.
No. In order to convert, in order to make our ideas attractive, and not only our ideas, I'm very open to discuss all kinds of different ideas with other people, is that we need to make them understandable. And this is something that people are forgetting. If your ideas are too complicated, then that means you're not understanding them well. If you can explain a concept to a, I'm not saying a college kid, but someone in middle school, that means you can understand well your ideas and you can teach them to all kinds of audiences. And you can actually explain, you can engage in conversation with them. And well, this is kind of troublesome because there's a lot of people, this happening a lot of the time, especially in Latin America, given that our education system is more based on credentials than on actual merit. You have people who don't know their trades, don't know their professions, and they're teaching. And then you have problems like students who present theses. I presented my thesis on Schmidt. I studied law. And none of my professors actually knew what it was about. There was only one, and he was kind of worried because that's me. That was about the Schmidt.
No, so I mean, to wrap it up, I mean, that's why the great books conversation and the rediscovery of the great books is so important. Because again, it's hard to have a conversation with somebody on Shakespeare if they haven't read Shakespeare. So just talking about Carl Schmitt, I mean, so I read Carl Schmitt too as an undergraduate in philosophy. So I think he has a lot of very insightful things to say, and he's very prescient about a number of things, despite a rather unsavory personal and political history. But when you're engaged in the life of the mind, that isn't out of bounds. I mean, if that was, then we wouldn't read Martin Heidegger either. But he's so important and had so many things to say. And that argument can then subsequently be made about virtually every author who's included in the great books idea. And I mean, this is the barbarism against the great books that you see. Well, why do people want to get rid of Homer? Well, he was a white man and he was supposedly misogynistic. So what does he have to say to modern society? And I find that to be very tragic, very crude, and very sad that you're not going to discover the beauty and the love of Homer because of preconditioned political ideology.
Yes. And well, given that we didn't talk about Eric Vogelin since we should have, but there's something that I think that needs
another time for Eric Vogelin. Yeah. He's great.
Yeah, no.
Not to mention the fact that he's the namesake of the journal that I'm editor of.
Yeah, no. The thing about Vogelin is that he actually understood that our age was plagued by Gnosticism, and that
yes,
people, intellectuals, were trying to promote that idea that our current world, that our ideas, that our regime or establishment or whatever is bad because it is not what the illuminated ones, the enlightened ones, are supposed to be teaching, because they are teaching the actual truth. And when these people, they get into power, they engage in what Hayek calls constructivist rationalism. They create institutions, but they're designed. They're not built from the ground up. They're not built by people, but they're built by power. And in our current age, I think that maybe the great books tradition is a good way to start, because they have already been built. There was people before
Yeah.
us who wrote, who had these ideas, who taught these ideas. There are people who got these ideas, they engaged with them, they created their own works, they expanded the great conversation. And now we only have to look at those books, we have to study them, we have to read them, and we can get some of the wisdom of the past. We can get some of that useful knowledge we had from history, and just try to follow it, and to live and to lead a good life for others, and to create communities that are based on love and our common interest, instead of just trying to engage and to have conflicts with other over facts and logic.
Yes, that's right, and I suppose I'll end it here as I have to get going soon. But I suppose it's providential that you said it, because I say this all the time. The most powerful and the most moving speeches are not speeches that deal with, quote, facts and logic. They're speeches that move the heart, that move passion. There's a reason why anybody who's trained in rhetoric, there's an element of sophistry in this, and I'm not endorsing sophistry, but there is an element of truth in what they have to say. Nobody's going to remember your speech when you tell them, and this is how you see it play out in politics too. Everybody goes to sleep and yawns when you say, we're going to increase the tax rate by so-and-so percent, we're going to get $300 million, and we're going to create 2,000 jobs. That doesn't sell. What do you have to say? We're going to do this, and we're going to build thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands, right? It's moved on passion, because we are creatures of the heart. And I think the great wisdom of the great books, our artistic and literary tradition, and even the best of our philosophy, our theology, our politics, tells us the same exact thing. Think about the greatest books you love, the greatest movies that you like, even simple, simplistic popcorn flicks actually often tell you that. If you've ever seen, for instance, the movie Armageddon, the Bruce Willis movie, the asteroids coming down to destroy the Earth, nobody is going to say that is a particularly deep film, but I like it. I enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun. But it essentially tells us what our great books are telling us too. An act of sacrificial love, Bruce Willis's character, allows for life and love on Earth to continue. So that's really what the great books are about. That's what the philosophy of the great books aims to cultivate in everybody who either comes through a proper great books education or encounters a great books education informally. It's all about cultivating a life of the heart and the mind, so that you can live a life of the heart and the mind in the life that you have here on Earth.
Well, that was great for our closure. I would like to thank you very much for having joined me today.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, I hope to have you on the channel as well. And please, for all the people who are watching us or will watch us, I put Paul's channel and his journal, the journal he edits, and as well as his personal website, the Minerva Wisdom, on the links below. So yeah, please check him out. And that will be all for today. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye. See you.